Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I hope you're enjoying the heat wave coming up later tonight. We'll be talking about Donald Trump, who has given his speech to the Republican convention. Joe Biden might be dropping out this weekend. Also, we'll talk about the unrest in Leeds. So many false narratives circulating around that. So we'll be speaking to our North of England editor to clear things up. Later in the show, I will be joined by Aaron Bastani. First, though, very big news when it comes to the International Court of Justice and Palestine. In a landmark ruling, the International Court of Justice has today ruled that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories is in breach of international law. The ruling included a judgment that Israel had effectively illegally annexed large parts of Palestinian territories.
Having examined Israel's policies and practices, both in relation to East Jerusalem and to the West Bank, with a view to determining whether they amount to annexation, the court comes to the conclusion that Israel's policies and practices, including the maintenance and expansion of settlements, the construction of associated infrastructure and the wall, the exploitation of natural resources, the proclamation of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the comprehensive application of Israeli domestic law in East Jerusalem, and its extensive application in the West Bank, entrench Israel's control of the occupied Palestinian territory, notably of East Jerusalem and of Area C of the West Bank. These policies and practices are designed to maintain in place indefinitely to remain in place indefinitely and to create irreversible effects on the ground. Consequently, the court considered that these policies and practices amount to annexation of large parts of the occupied Palestinian territory.
Nawaf Salam, who is the president of the ICJ, also stated that Israel was guilty of systematic discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity, meaning it is in breach of the prohibition on racial segregation and apartheid. Right, so this is the Apartheid Convention. This has found it's in breach of that. Really, really significant there. He also read out the court's judgment about what should happen next.
By 14 votes to 1, is of the opinion that the State of Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. In favor, President Salam, Judges Tomka, Abraham, Yusuf, Shway, Bandari, Iwasawa, Nolte, Chargeworth, Brand, Gomez, Robledo, Cleveland, Uresco, Tladi. Against, Vice President Sibeltinde.
Speaking after the ruling, Palestinian Foreign Affairs Minister Dr. Riyad Maliki said this.
This ruling couldn't be more timely or sorely needed. The Palestinian people have endured unbearable suffering and injustice for decades. Israel's colonial, expansionist, and genocidal policies are on full horrific display before the world. The Palestinian people are confronting a ferocious genocide and defending their very right to exist and live. This ruling is a vindication of their steadfastness and perseverance. Today is about the brave and noble Palestinian people and their absolute, non-negotiable right to freedom from colonial control and violence.
I'm joined now by Clive Baldwin, Senior Legal Advisor at Human Rights Watch. Thank you for joining us. Could I get you to begin by talking about the significance of today's ruling?
Yes, thanks for having me on, Michael. And today's a historic ruling. The International Court of Justice in The Hague only gives a handful of these advisory opinions on issues of international law. This is the first one in 5 years, and only the second time it's considered the situation of Israel and Palestine. And this is historic for many reasons. One of them, which you mentioned, is the first ruling by an international court on apartheid, and it's found that Israel was responsible for violating the prohibition of apartheid and racial segregation, and saying this is a clearly illegal issue on apartheid and not just a political discussion.
You've mentioned already this is an advisory ruling. Could you explain to the audience what that means? What does it mean for the ICJ to deliver an advisory ruling?
Yeah. On one hand, you can say it's not technically legally binding on states because because it was directed at all states, not like the same courts considering the case of South Africa versus Israel, and every order issued then has been binding on Israel. But these advisory opinions, they have a great degree of legal, moral authority, and they continue to apply for many years. People are still using the law that was set out in the last opinion of the court on Israel, the construction of the wall in occupied territory, which was 20 years ago. So the case then goes back formally to the UN, to the General Assembly, maybe to the Security Council to enforce it. But it's also what the court says about the law is it's the highest court in the world. So many states, many courts will follow it. And what it said about the illegality of settlements, the racial discrimination, and many other issues as well about Israel's policies in the occupied territory.
And I suppose just to go into a bit more of the legal reasoning. So as far as I understand, when it comes to the occupation, the illegality, that question had a lot to do with whether or not this was permanent or temporary. So I think a temporary occupation sort of in a time of war is potentially legal. But the question was whether or not this was permanent. I mean, they've been there for, they've been occupying the West Bank for 50 odd years. So, I mean, it seems like a bit of a slam dunk. But was there ever any question that the court would rule anything other than the occupation being illegal?
You can never tell with a court what it's going to rule on. It partly depends on the evidence, the arguments which are put before it. In this case, it's said the continuing occupation and continuing presence of Israel in the occupied territories is unlawful because of the de facto or creeping annexation, the deprivation of Palestinians of their right to self-determination over a long occupation, but not just the length of the occupation, the nature of it, and what's amounted to the imposition of Israeli law, for example, in large parts of the occupied territory, including East Jerusalem and Area C.
And what happens now? Another Palestinian sort of Minister of Foreign Affairs has said, we'll go back to the UN with this. I mean, what does that mean? I suppose with reference to, you mentioned just a moment ago that 20 years ago they made a similar ruling about the wall that they built to sort of separate the Palestinian territories and Israel. And the reason that was illegal is because loads of it was on Palestinian land. So it's just very obviously annexing quite a lot of Palestine. But did that change anything? I suppose, what were the impacts of that ruling 20 years ago, and what can that teach us about what this ruling might mean now?
Yeah, I think on one hand, to say the war is still there 20 years later, but on the other, many of the legal rulings that the court made then are used now about does human rights law apply in occupation. Some of this might have seemed obvious, but it wasn't always, at least to lawyers. And there's some really key aspects of the ruling today as well, when it said clearly that Gaza remained occupied territory even after the Israelis pulled their armed forces out nearly 20 years ago. So that some people have been debating that for years, but that's quite clear. It's partly what happens at the General Assembly. The last of these advisory opinions 5 years ago by this court was actually concerning the UK and the Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean. The court then said those were effectively unlawfully governed by the UK because they hadn't decolonized it and they deported the entire population. The UK government then said, well, this is just an advisory opinion. We don't need to care about it. When they were faced with almost complete isolation in the General Assembly, they eventually started to open negotiations with Mauritius because of that court ruling. So some of the impact can be long-term. What happens now as well is the court also directed its findings at all states and the United Nations, saying they cannot and should not continue to assist and help Israel in any unlawful acts at all. And that matters for arms sales. I think this case will certainly be used in any case challenging arms sales by certain states to Israel. Settlement products, maybe. It's said that also that states need to clearly differentiate in how they treat Israel and the occupied territories. So that matters for products.
Does that mean, should I sort of take from that this ruling by the International Court of Justice will be used by people taking cases to domestic courts to say, you go to a British court and say the British government shouldn't export arms to Israel, or can you go to a domestic court and say this company shouldn't be investing in the West Bank? Sort of just talk me through the practicalities, I suppose.
Yeah, certainly it can be used by those saying that companies, that states, domestic states, are assisting Israel with wrongdoing. And that could include the settlements. I mean, it was already clear settlements were unlawful. The courts made it even clearer and what that means, including the support for settlements. So having said it's unlawful in international law, anyone bringing such cases domestically can use this court to say what it is. It has wide implications as well, such as apartheid. The word, when it gets used at times, has been dismissed. It's been dismissed as being a political or outrageous comparison with South Africa. For those interested, you could read the separate opinion of the president of the court. He goes into a lot more detail on this than the court ruling does. About why it's apartheid and what that means. So it's showing clearly apartheid's a legal determination. And it matters today for countries and anyone trying to get countries to change their position on anything that's supporting wrongdoing by Israel. That would include the UK, for example. It's been the last government submitted this application at the other court in The Hague, the International Criminal Court, to try to claim that the court shouldn't have jurisdiction over Israeli citizens. I think a lot of the arguments in this case today could be used against the UK there, because they claimed because of the Oslo Peace Accords that should override everything. This court today said it shouldn't. Everything still has to comply with international law. So it can be used there. And it's another reason why this new government in the UK should drop its opposition in the International Criminal Court. By the way, the UK, the previous government, was one of the countries most opposed to this ICJ ruling. It argued against it, and its arguments were comprehensively, rejected by the court today.
Clive Baldwin, thank you so much for joining us and giving us that briefing on that very significant decision at the International Court of Justice today. I think that it's very significant, seems, the apartheid ruling. I mean, when we talk about it on this show, often because, it's often been because someone in the Labour Party says you can't call Israel apartheid, or someone, they're threatened to lose the whip or something bizarre like that. When we say this is not an extreme position, this is the position of Amnesty International, of B'Tselem, of Human Rights Watch, and now, of course, everyone can add, and the highest court in the world, the International Court of Justice. In related news today, Foreign Secretary David Lammy has announced that the UK government is restoring its funding to UNRWA, that's the UN Relief and Works Agency, so the main agency supplying aid to Palestinians. UNRWA funding was paused by the British government and multiple other states in January after allegations by Israel that 12 UN staff were linked to the 7th of October attack. Of course, those allegations came on the same day that the ICJ made their previous ruling that Israel was potentially guilty of genocidal acts. Back to UNRWA, after an independent investigation and an action plan provided by UNRWA itself, most countries have now resumed their funding, with the exception being the United States, where Congress has banned payments to UNRWA until March 2025. I'm joined now by Aaron Bastani. Another situation really here, isn't it, today? We've got this sort of momentous decision from the ICJ and the absolute bare minimum from the British government.
Well, the bare minimum, yes, but I am still somewhat surprised, Michael, because if you look at, for instance, the manoeuvring by the domestic Zionist lobby in this country, Labour Friends of Israel have actually, believe it or not, been in favour of doing what Labour has chosen to do, which shocked me. Very, very surprised. Because if you look at what came out from the Board of Deputies, they said the complete opposite. They said this should not be happening. That was announced today, but we kind of knew in advance that would be their position. So they are doing the bare minimum, but given the political signalling and the key stakeholders in terms of party management for the Labour Party who've mattered over the last 3, 4, 5 years, I am somewhat surprised, pleasantly. It's not a huge deal in the context of international affairs. Like you say, Michael, we were very much the outliers. But it's positive. It's not negative, and that's something.
In what has been called the largest outage in history, airports, healthcare services, and many banks were today unable to function normally as their computer systems went down. I use a Mac, so I wouldn't know, but this is apparently called the blue screen of death, which means a Microsoft device needs to be rebooted. That was shared by some people in their office. The blue screen could also be seen in airports and train stations, meaning formerly automatic services had to be done manually. In total, across the globe, over 3,000 flights have been cancelled due to the outage. And it even shut down Sky News, perhaps most important of all. One of the hosts tweeted, "We're obviously not on air, but we're trying." The outage was caused by a security update installed across Microsoft systems by the cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike. This is what the BBC said about that company. Like a lot of modern technology companies, it hasn't been around that long. It was founded a mere 13 years ago, but has grown to employ nearly 8,500 people. As a provider of cybersecurity services, it tends to get called in to deal with the aftermath of hack attacks. So it has been involved in investigations of several high-profile cyber attacks, such as when Sony Pictures had its computer system hacked in 2014. But this time, because of a flawed update to its software, a firm that is normally part of the solution to IT problems has instead caused it. In its last earnings report, CrowdStrike declared a total of nearly 24,000 customers. That's an indication not just of the size of the issue, but also the difficulties that could be involved in fixing it. Each of those customers is a huge organization in itself, so the number of individual computers affected is hard to estimate. Aaron, all I really know of sort of software updates is when I get the pop-up in the corner of my laptop, and then I always click remind me later because I only see it when I'm using my laptop by definition, and I'm not very good at forward planning when it comes to these things. Can you give us any more insight into what it means when a company like CrowdStrike says they try and update their system to sort of protect these systems, and then the whole thing comes crashing down? What can we draw from this?
Well, I don't think I can offer you any more insight, Michael, because I'm not a particularly insightful person on these things. Also, I should add, Michael, as is, I think, standard at Novara Media, I'm an Apple user. But what's really interesting here is actually this is a US-based company, and this is something we don't talk about very often. For me, here's the interesting angle. This is the exact kind of infrastructure that all of us depend on. It's the architecture for the global economy. And it's a US company, I think, based in Dallas, Texas, which nobody has heard of. It has assets of $6 billion. When we talk about technological sovereignty, I mean, this is just one example, and it's gone wrong, and so we've noticed it. But there are so many companies like this, hundreds of companies like this, almost all of them in terms of the UK and most of Europe, based in the United States, who we depend on for the basics of life. A great example, and these are more valuable companies, Novara Media. We cannot produce the media you watch every day without Adobe products. Adobe, I think, as a company now worth more than maybe $100 billion US by market cap. Very valuable company. We can't get to you without YouTube, without X, without Meta products. So you may have heard of those companies. You may not have heard of Adobe, slightly less important. But this is one of the many, many, many companies you will have never heard of, without which we cannot exist. So for that, I'm grateful to them. Thank you very much. It's pulled back the curtain how important this digital infrastructure is. But like I say, Mike, I think beyond today, it's not really huge news.
The sort of standard left-wing line that I see on this is to sort of say, it's screwed up, therefore we need more regulation. Obviously, Microsoft is basically a monopoly in many senses. Obviously, we're just saying we use Apple, but sort of for many business services, I think it's a monopoly. And people say, well, if it's got this much power, it should need more regulation. I mean, without being an IT expert in any shape or form, you could kind of make the opposite argument, which is this really doesn't happen very often, right? So, the system, when the system does shut down to this extent, we do notice because the planes are delayed. And it does seem like these companies add quite a lot of value. Of course, they're also making shed loads of money, but the service isn't terrible and doesn't seem to crash. So while sort of like there's this distress that we're so reliant on these globally interconnected firms, maybe we can manage a sort of a little hiccup every decade. It doesn't seem to happen very often.
Well, but this company is, Michael, this is not Microsoft, just to be clear. Microsoft is a multi-trillion-dollar company. This is certainly more than 1 trillion. This is a smaller company, like I said, with about $6 billion worth of assets, 8,500 employees. You are right in so much as they do offer tremendous value and they do a lot. You have some counter arguments, perhaps like Amazon, where you'd say, well, they've destroyed so much bricks and mortar offline business that we have to do an account sheet here. But for goods and services like this, I would agree. The real bad guys for me in 21st century capitalism, and of course I have a big problem with the digital giants too in many respects, particularly Amazon. But the real bad guys for me, Michael, is wealth management, private equity. They're adding zero new value for goods and services. They're not making life any better for anyone. they're just squeezing that value out parasitically to make themselves, often the associates that work at these places, and of course their shareholders, very rich. So you're right to say this is interesting and it's conspicuous in so much as it so rarely happens, and I think that's fair. But it is a question as well, Michael. I think for Europeans, in so much as so much of this infrastructure is American, and yes, over the last 20 years that's not been a problem. But in a world of potential deglobalization, potential fallings out between the White House and various European heads of state, etc., these are the kinds of things we need to think about. Personally, I would like, in the abstract, I'm not going to give you this or that company in this or that field, but I would like more of this kind of architecture to be based in Europe. I think Europeans outsourcing their technological infrastructure, outsourcing their military defense, everything, basically, to the United States, their energy, it's probably not good. And by the way, the Americans like it that way. It means they get to sell us lots of stuff. And every month, billions, tens of billions of dollars go across the Atlantic Ocean just so that we can keep our basic systems running.
Just 5 days after the failed attempt on his life, Donald Trump has given his set-piece speech to the Republican National Convention. We were promised that after the assassination attempt on his life, Donald Trump had rewritten his speech to emphasize unity, and the speech did begin that way.
4 months from now, we will have an incredible victory, and we will begin the 4 greatest years in the history of our country. Together, we will launch a new era of safety, prosperity, and freedom for citizens of every race, religion, color, and creed. The discord and division in our society must be healed. We must heal it quickly. As Americans, we are bound together by a single fate and a shared destiny. We rise together or we fall apart. I am running to be president for all of America, not half of America.
Trump went on to give an account of the assassination attempt against him, and where he praised the Secret Service personnel who rushed to his defense, praised the audience for not stampeding, and gave that lesson in anatomy.
There's an interesting statistic. The ears are the bloodiest part. If something happens with the ears, they bleed more than any other part of the body. For whatever reason, the doctors told me that. I said, why is there so much blood? He said, it's the ears. They bleed more. So we learned something, but they just, this beautiful crowd, they didn't want to leave me. They knew I was in trouble. They didn't want to leave me. And you can see that love written all over their faces.
Trump also said he survived because he had God on his side.
I'm not supposed to be here tonight. Not supposed to be here.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Thank you. But I'm not. And I'll tell you, I stand before you in this arena only by the grace of Almighty God. In watching the reports over the last few days, many people say it was a providential moment. Probably was.
Probably was. He always had messianic tendencies, of course. The failed assassination attempt has, allowed that to go up a few notches. You saw there, obviously, the sort of the gauze on his ear, which lots of people in the audience started wearing as well in solidarity. Trump on stage also paid tribute to the man who was killed at his rally. He's called Corey Comparatore.
He was a highly respected former fire chief, respected by everybody. Was accompanied by his wife, Helen, incredible woman. I spoke to her today, devastated, and 2 precious daughters. He lost his life selflessly acting as a human shield to protect them from flying bullets. He went right over the top of them and was hit. What a fine man he was.
So all of this happened in the first 15 minutes of the speech, and it was all quite dramatic. But after that, the speech went on for another hour and 15 minutes, and it was fairly rambling. Like in 2016, he talked about increasing tariffs to protect American jobs. He repeated the same complaints he's had for the past 8 years about being pursued by the justice system. And of course, he rallied against irregular immigration.
Less than 4 years ago, I handed this administration the strongest border in American history. But you can see on the chart that saved my life, that was the chart that saved my life. I said, look it, I'm so proud of it. I think it's one of the greatest. It was done by the Border Patrol, one of the greatest charts I've ever seen. It showed everything just like that. You know the chart. Oh, there it is. That's pretty good. Wow. Last time I put up that chart, I never really got to look at it. But without that chart, I would not be here today. Never got to look at it.
Aaron, I want your thoughts on this. I have to admit, I only managed to watch the first hour of the RNC speech because by that time it was getting all a little bit rambly and repetitive. I've seen lots of people sort of on the Democrat side say, this is the first time Trump's looked beatable. I suppose at the same time, I imagine what most people are going to pay attention to, because most people don't watch 90-minute speeches, are those sort of set piece acts at the beginning, where he's describing the assassination attempt, he's kissing the helmet of the guy who died. There was some real political theatre there. What have you made of it all? What have you made of it all?
Well, there's that line, of course, that you should judge somebody's TV performance as a politician by turning the volume off. I mean, that's a classic example, right? You would have no sound. All you would see is Trump, gauze on his ear. That's a visual cue before anything else. The fact he's walked over to that firefighter suit, he's kissed it. I mean, I was actually laughing when I saw that, because it's obviously very sad, but it's just kind of strange the way he daintily kissed this helmet. He's a very, very strange character. And then he goes back, and then he's surrounded by all these graphs. You could turn the noise down there and you think, this is interesting. This isn't like a normal political speech. And it very much captures the attention. Look, the idea that somehow Trump isn't going to win because his arguments don't make sense is simply not viable, in my opinion. In 2016, after Trump and the victory of Brexit, we heard that argument: don't bring arguments to a feelings fight. Now, of course, you should try and argue logically, rationally, make your point, and so on. But there'll clearly be a part of the electorate which isn't moved by those kinds of things. And by the way, the Democrats have known that in the past. Lots of people voted for Barack Obama in 2008 because of hope and change. These were very ambiguous, emotional things. Or Bill Clinton in 1992 when he went on Arsenio Hall playing the saxophone. He wasn't making some wonky policy argument. It was a feeling. It was a vibe. So those things matter. And I still think that Trump really is the master of that stuff. And the vibe around Biden in 2020 was actually a winning vibe, strangely. He was an old guy. He was just the right side of too old. Now he's the wrong side of too old. He was the right side of too old, just experienced enough without being past it. And somebody who's just a bit more relaxed. He's seen it all. He's not going to be fazed by Trump in the way that, say, Ted Cruz was, or Marco Rubio was, or various, Democratic politicians have been, young bucks. Biden was the opposite of that. Joe Biden, of course, I think 81, 82, Donald Trump 78, so just slightly older. Now, though, I just think that argument's completely lost any validity. I know we'll go on to that later on. But with this kind of theatre, I think you need a strong candidate. And look, I've been wrong before. We were wrong before. We didn't think that Joe Biden was the appropriate candidate to fight Trump in 2020. We were wrong. That said, of course, Michael, there was COVID. That really did create a set of circumstances which, in retrospect, were uniquely disadvantageous for Trump. It is very hard to be a right-wing populist when there is a pandemic and your whole shtick is individual liberty, smaller state, not being too serious. I mean, good luck trying that when tens of thousands of people are dying every week, I think, at one point. So Joe Biden was just about good enough to get over the line last time. I suspect he isn't now. And I have to be honest, Michael, we can criticize Donald Trump till the cows come home. But for a guy who's 78, 79, he still has incredible energy. Now, people might be watching or listening to this and saying, oh my God, Aaron, stop being ageist. As I've said so many times, to win the nomination for a political party takes incredible stamina, resilience, guts, energy, enthusiasm. To run for the presidency, you're on the go. It's like a rock band stadium tour, but for longer. You're on the go constantly. Now, I know that Trump just has the best. Of course, Biden does as well, whether that's food, accommodation. But it is really hard going. It's hard going. It's tiring for somebody in their 20s or 30s, let alone their late 70s. And I think a lot of people will look at how he's responded to these events and they'll be impressed. That's my view. I'm sure people disagree watching this, but I think the average Joe, even if they're not planning to vote for him, even if they despise him, will be like, wow, that guy is 78, 79. He has some constitution. I wish I did. Here's an interesting fact as well. I didn't know this, Michael, but Trump's mum was actually a Gaelic-speaking Scot. Now, I knew he had Scots heritage, but his mum was a Gaelic-speaking Scot. So there's a little bit of Highlander in Trump, Michael, and that came through a little bit with the old fist. The fist pumps and this fighting spirit. There's something there which I think for lots of Republican voters is very, how can I put this? Primal. It's primal. You can't necessarily talk about these things with words. I remember seeing him shot and, pumping his fist, and it moved something even in me, which you can't really explain. Defiance. Even if it's somebody who you don't like or agree with, defiance is an extraordinarily moving thing. And to finish, like I say, for somebody of that age to respond like that, even those who have tremendous antipathy for him, they'll be impressed.
No, I mean, I think kind of everyone does admit that now. And I think Donald Trump, even before the assassination attempt, his strategy at the election was to say, I'm strong, Joe Biden is weak. And then Joe Biden seeming incredibly weak all the time and a bit confused, and Trump, standing up and sort of pumping his fist in the face of an assassination attempt. I mean, it's definitely fed into that narrative. Also, I do think that sort of liberal media, understandably, is struggling with this. I was listening to sort of like a New York Times podcast this week, and sort of they were saying, Donald Trump has this victim narrative, and the assassination attempt, he's now using that to feed into that. I'm like, fair, he probably is, but I mean, also he wasn't really assassinated. Like lots of the times when Trump was making himself into the victim, you could be like, that was ridiculous. But this time he was a couple of millimeters away from having his head blown off. So, it's hard to argue with that. The candidate that Donald Trump will face in November is still not entirely certain, of course. Earlier in the week, Joe Biden caused further concern about his mental state when he struggled to finish sentences in a speech, even when using an autocue.
I know you say, Joe, you may not have a Congress. Well, guess what? You all told me I couldn't pass the Inflation Reduction Act. You all told me I couldn't face it. Anyway, we did it. We're going to bring rents down, as I said. We're going to build 2 million affordable homes. And cap rent increases of 5% a year so corporate landlords can't God. Anyway, I don't want to get going. I'm going to get very upset. But there's gouging America. And by the way, not only saves lives, it will save taxpayers. Just what I did on the first round on dealing with Medicare. It saves the taxpayer $160 billion because they don't have to pay these exorbitant prices to these anyway.
Senior Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, have been urging Biden to step aside. And according to Axios, party elites believe he could exit the race as soon as this weekend. Interestingly, while senior centrist Democrats have been pushing for Biden to stand aside, some of his last defenders are from the Progressive Caucus. Earlier in the week, Bernie Sanders wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times calling for Biden to stay in the race. In the piece, Sanders called Biden the most effective president in the modern history of our country. Though in an interview a few days later in The New Yorker, he didn't sound especially confident. So this was his justification for backing Biden. I'm not aware that anyone thinks that Joe Biden is the best candidate in the history of the world, or that he's an ideal candidate. And no one will argue with you that he has a trails off, so Sanders also trailing off. He admitted it. Sometimes he gets confused about names. You're right. Sometimes he doesn't put 3 sentences together. It is true. But the reality of the moment is, in my view, he is the best candidate the Democrats have for a variety of reasons. And trying in an unprecedented way to take him off the ticket would do a lot more harm than good. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has also opposed replacing Biden, saying this.
What I'm saying is like the mechanisms with which this decision is being made is concerning me. And when I'm talking to folks in rooms, I hear my donor this, my donor that. Those are the inputs that I am hearing reflected by my colleagues. It's not my voters this, my voters that.
Now, I think those concerns about how decisions are made are probably valid, but it is also true that a lot of voters want Biden to stand aside. So according to a new poll by the Associated Press, nearly 2/3 of Democrat voters want Biden to stand aside. So why might the left be backing Biden when the centrists aren't? Vox reported this. Biden's need for allies, wherever he can get them, may have created an opportunity for progressives to negotiate with him on policy. AOC made this explicit in her comments earlier this month, saying that Biden should lean into a bolder economic agenda and move further towards the working class. That seems to be what's happening. Biden is suddenly pushing progressive priorities from Supreme Court reforms to capping rents. He has also renewed his calls for an assault weapons ban following the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump at a rally last weekend. Those policies might be good, but there's not much point in promising them if Biden can't win. And his announcement of one of those policies, so the rent controls, it didn't cause much hope on that point.
The idea that corporate-owned housing is able to raise your rent $300-400 a month or something, under what I'm about to announce, they can't raise it more than $55.
Well, the actual policy isn't that landlords can't increase your rent by any more than $55. It's that they can't increase your rent by more than 5%. But obviously he's sort of really, really struggling to read the auto cue and says $55. After that, you actually heard a big cheer because he was saying, I'm announcing this policy. They can't raise your rent by more than $55. And everyone's like, yeah. Aaron, it's slightly odd. It seems like there is so much momentum now for Biden to be pushed aside. Some even saying as soon as this weekend, Nancy Pelosi, apparently Obama is now sort of, I mean, he hasn't said it publicly, but apparently people close to Obama are saying that he thinks Biden should consider his position. And then really the last people standing around Joe Biden are the squad and Bernie Sanders. It seems like a risky move from the left wing of the Democrat Party. What do you think?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Look, you don't want to be associated with a terrific defeat. And look, if for whatever reason Joe Biden goes into this election and he loses like Mondale in '84, right? I don't think anybody's suggesting it'd be that bad, but it could be. That's the worst case scenario. I think Mondale in '84 against Reagan. I think he picks up one state out of 50, I think. I could be wrong. People can have a look. But it's pretty bad. Now, Trump, I don't think Trump can do that, but I think it could be a big win. I think it could be as big or bigger than 2016. Worst case scenario, if Biden carries on like this. Do you want to be associated with that? Do you want your quote-unquote left-wing policy platform to be associated with that? Because it'll get a hiding, and then corporate America and the people that fund Gavin Newsom and the people that always hated you are going to blame you. They're going to primary you. They're going to fund the people who are going to get rid of you. So I don't quite understand why you would do that, especially when actually the truth is the complete opposite. Joe Biden was very much the establishment candidate within the Democratic Party against Bernie Sanders in 2020. This is what they wanted. Let them deal with it. Now, look, there's a calculation there, presumably, that AOC and Bernie, they think that he can win and that their policy agenda can still be advanced, that by showing loyalty, and if he wins, it's high stakes, they'll begin to earn more credibility and goodwill from parts of the Democratic coalition, not just in politics, but also in the media, and that's useful going forward. I mean, I kind of get all that, but look, he genuinely can't put 2 sentences together. It seems an incredibly risky strategy, incredibly risky. And there's a line there from AOC, I'm hearing my donor this, my donor that. Just because they're donors doesn't make them wrong, Okay. This seems like a massive overcompensation that is kind of something you might expect from a radical left-wing politician. She's not that radical, but the idea that, oh, well, because they're donors saying this and not regular voters, well, then that can't be true. A donor can just as much have their finger on the pulse as a voter. And like you say, actually, voters say exactly the same thing across the United States. In swing states in particular, people are responding in opinion polls by saying that Joe Biden is too old. Even in terms of the overall share of the vote, I think the most recent polling I saw had him 1% behind Trump. Now, of course, Democrats need to win by 4 or 5%. And even then, it can be close with regards to the popular vote to win the Electoral College. Right now, Biden is losing on that vote share. So I don't get it. Like I said, it's high risk, high reward, but also with the best one in the world, the man is 81, 82 by the next election and by the following January when he's inaugurated. Will he see a full second term? This could be disastrous. And it's very strange to me that the left wing of the Democratic Party are so intent on associating themselves with something which could historically look appalling.
I also think that Joe Biden will get toppled over the weekend. I suppose then I think actually probably the most likely outcome is Joe Biden gets toppled, he gets replaced, and then the Democrats still lose. So maybe actually sort of if you're thinking about how you look strategically in the long term, having been opposed to him being toppled, then him getting toppled and that person lose, because then you can say, well, Biden, maybe he would have won. I suppose maybe that is a position you can find yourself in. I think it's more because they think that Biden is more malleable to their agenda than whoever replaces him will be. They don't seem to be particularly keen on Kamala Harris, I would imagine. But yeah, I can see why the left would sort of bite their tongue at this point to say, yeah, we don't really want to get involved in this whole topple Biden thing. We don't want to get blamed if everything goes, tits up. But the idea of sort of saying we're actively going to try and defend this guy seems a little bit odd to me. Hundreds of people in the street, burning buses, and a police car flipped. Those were the scenes in one part of Leeds last night. Harehills is a poor and highly diverse neighbourhood located in the east of the city. The unrest reportedly began after an altercation involving children being taken into care by agency workers. Police attended the scene and people appeared to first throw things at a police car before flipping it on its side. Police withdrew and the disturbance was drawn down the area's main road. In terms of damage, a delivery driver caught in the disorder had his vehicle raided and the goods set alight, and a bus was halted before also being set on fire. Outside of Leeds, the disturbances drew the attention of many on the right, who blamed the unrest, predictably I suppose, on multiculturalism, and a Green Party councillor became the subject of particularly unpleasant attacks. Tommy Robinson, so the far-right activist, tweeted this: "Let me introduce you to the newly elected councillor for the area rioting tonight in Leeds. Multiple reports he's even on the streets with them." The councillor pictured in that tweet is Motin Ali. He made the news, back in May when he shouted Allahu Akbar after his election. Last night, though, the attacks on him were absolutely nothing but slander, and in fact, it turns out he was a hero of the night.
Whoa, that's Councillor Motin Ali from Green Party trying to stop it. He's a good man. He's trying to stop it. He doesn't condone this behavior. I really want to help him, but Councillor Motin Ali from Green Party is stopping it.
Who's inside the house? He's gonna be blessed like that. Think before you act. Children in there. Your family's in there.
An incredibly brave thing to do, not just sort of asking people. I mean, I think even actually getting involved in the middle of a riot and saying, please stop, that takes some bravery, but then sort of physically, holding a wheelie bin as someone's trying to push it into the fire. That's an incredibly brave thing to do. And that man was, completely smeared. And there was a Tory MP this morning who was sort of tweeting, oh, this guy, he says he was against the riot, but here's a picture of him taking part. And the picture doesn't show him taking part. It just shows him there. And when you see the videos, what he's clearly trying to do is stop the riot. To talk more about this story, I'm joined now by Craig Gent, Novara's North of England editor, who happens to live in Harehills. Craig, you were at the scene for Novara last night. Can you tell us more about what you witnessed?
The first thing you see is smoke. You see it all rising above the city, and then lots of people all walking in the same direction to go and see what's happening. Basically, this is a really densely packed neighborhood. So a lot of people have been sort of asking why people are going out there to have a look. There is no out there; it's just right here. Everything is happening in one place. Once I got there, I saw sort of smouldering debris in the middle of crossroads, and then just around the corner, a double-decker bus that had been set alight and turned into basically an enormous bonfire.
And so it seems to have started because the police were trying to take away a child from a Romanian family. The circumstances of that seem to be very much unknown. How did that develop into a more general riot situation involving lots of different people?
The police were called to support agency workers who were involved in taking some children into care. So the police, I don't think, were taking the children themselves, so to speak, but kind of under a court order, is my understanding. What happened then, of course, is that as soon as this is happening and there's lots of shouting and screaming, other residents begin to come outside to see what's happening, and the strap line, if you like, is essentially the police are taking someone's kids away. So naturally, obviously, emotions are running high at that point. The police begin to move out of the area. I believe they're instructed to move further out of the area. But essentially what they do is they begin leading people down the length of Harehills Lane, which is a really busy and dense street that runs right through the middle of the neighborhood. And so the whole time, the crowd is essentially growing. Finally, it stops at a busy crossroads. This is where people see footage, for example, of people raiding a van that has been stopped in the middle of the crossroads. And then very close by, that's where the bus was halted and then set on fire.
Can we read much into this? So I suppose often sort of when we talk about riots, it follows, say, an example of sort of police violence. So, someone getting killed at the hands of the police. Obviously, Mark Duggan being killed was the sort of prompt for the 2010s riots. And that gave it an obvious political import. I mean, can we read anything into what happened last night in Leeds?
I think it's hard to say because very quickly it became a disturbance not involving any one group of people. And so, of course, people are bringing different grievances out onto the streets. That's not to sort of, glorify or lionize, I should say, the actions of people who are like taking part in disorder per se, because realistically what was happening was, a lot of people are bored, maybe don't have much going on, and they're sort of just joining in because it's like, it's happening, it's something to do. So later on into the night, you began to see various members of the community trying to get in between people who would be adding literally fuel to the fire and trying to persuade them not to do it. And actually, I saw many times where that was a quite successful de-escalation, and people said, "Oh, fair enough. It's it's already happening." Was the kind of was the attitude.
I've seen lots of response from sort of right wingers about this, saying this is a sign that multiculturalism has gone wrong, that society is breaking down. As someone who lives in the area, I mean, could you sort of respond to that commentary?
It's just so much more complicated than that, isn't it? Like as people were saying to me last night, in Harehills, we're all sorts. We're white, we're Asian, Gypsies, Roma, Romanians, Slovakians, there's so many people from all walks of life living here. And the thing is that, these pretended divisions between different communities don't really survive very long when you put put them up against reality. I mean, take even last night, for example. It'd be easy to draw a narrative that says, it was a Romanian Roma family that was involved. So therefore, it was all started by Romanians and Roma in the area. And they were rioting, and it was British Asians who were trying to stop it from happening. That'd be one narrative that's like incredibly convenient. The truth is, I saw people people who are adding things to the fire or taking part in disturbance in an active way. They came from a range of backgrounds. They just do. And I saw one Romanian woman, saying, trying to persuade people, not to add, a bed, I think it was, to the burning bus. So it's just more complicated than that. And I think the thing is that you're always going to get these people who have a really strong desire to see a particular type of racially motivated, violent altercation, because it suits their narrative. Of course it does. But that's just not the reality. That's not how it was. That's not how it's going to be in the future, and just doesn't bear out in the facts.
We spend a lot of time in this country debating the human waste that gets pumped into our rivers. But in France, they've done something about it.
A big day for Paris, a big relief for the Olympics. After weeks of tests showing bacteria levels in the River Seine to be unacceptably high, with impeccable timing, things have come good. The city mayor, Anne Hidalgo, led the way. She'd made a vow to take a swim in front of the cameras to show to the world that the river once again is safe.
It's a very lucky and happy day. It's also for the planet, and for the river and for the ocean. We did it.
A select group was invited to join the swim, among them your correspondent.
Okay, here goes. I'm going to jump. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Quite a privilege. Apart from a few experiments in advance of the Olympics, this is the first legal swim here for more than a century.
Good stuff. I got a mouthful of water as I jumped in, but it tastes fine. Everything seems to be pretty cool. Water's gorgeous. A bit murky, but it feels good, and it's not cold at all. I think we're well set up for the Olympics.
Obviously, on a heat day in London, I feel very jealous watching that. I would love to swim in the Thames on my way home this evening. So how did the French do it? Well, this is from the National Geographic. Hidden underground near Paris's Austerlitz train station is a stormwater cistern that holds the equivalent of 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The Bassin de Austerlitz is a cornerstone of the plan to keep the Seine safe for swimming. Paris's sanitation system is largely a legacy of 19th century engineer Eugène Belgrand. Both rainwater and wastewater are channeled into a vast underground labyrinth of sewers and carried gravitationally to treatment plants outside Paris. But in times of heavy downpours, sewer valves were opened into the Seine to prevent an overflow into the streets. Tanks like this one will help avoid that scenario. Developed by a team of 40 engineers, the Bassin de Austerlitz is a technical marvel. So to me, that sounds like it's the same reason why we have shit in the rivers, which is that our human effluent, as they call it on the radio, and the rainwater goes into the same sewers. Then when it rains too much, instead of those backing up through our toilets and up our sinks, they have to release some of the sewage into the rivers. They've created sort of overflow tanks. They called them cisterns. To stop that happening. Presumably we're doing some of that here. We're actually getting a super sewer in London, so maybe that will help. Aaron, you were tweeting about this today and managed to get in, or yesterday, this week, managed to get into a bunch of arguments about whether the French are just better at doing stuff than we are. What was the nature of that dispute?
We're losing, Michael. We're losing. They're beating us really badly. Longer life expectancy, very low carbon intensity for their energy production, because of course they use a lot of nuclear, higher fertility rates, a hell of a lot more high-speed rail. I think 3 of the world's most 50 valuable companies are French. I think only 1 is in the UK. They, of course, have Europe's second most valuable company, but they have other firms too. People say, well, Britain's great for AI. We're better for AI. I mean, London is a hub for AI. That's fine. Although that said, France is actually catching up. They've got a pretty impressive company called Mistral. Yes, we have the English language. Okay, that's one advantage we probably will always have over France. If you look at their industrial complex, though, if you look at their food security, look at their energy security, they're killing us. And this is another example. Google Orléans, it's a city in France of 100,000 people. It has a tram system. It's like Worthing in this country having a tram system. You've got cities of 300,000 people, Southampton, Portsmouth, Bournemouth. They don't have a tram system. So we're losing very badly. And this is the icing on the cake. And there is a question really about, if things carry on as they are, to what extent can Paris take the crown of Europe's great city away from London? Of course, you've got right now this massive expansion of public transit in Paris, twice the size of Crossrail, this project that's being built. You have lots of people going there post-Brexit. I think that crown will take a long time to go, of course, because London is a phenomenal city. But it's something to bear in mind. And there's a lot of cope out there, right? When I made that post about how we're getting beaten really bad by France, London is getting beaten really bad by Paris. Somebody said, well, the Anglo model list. There is no Anglo model. This is cope. There is no Anglo model. There is an American model, and then there's us. But America has these absolutely enormous companies. It has a much higher GDP per capita. It has energy sovereignty because, of course, it does all the fracking. There's no Anglo model. This is pure and utter cope. We have no model. We had a model based upon the City of London, Southeast London, financial services, North Sea oil, gone, gone, gone. What are we going to do about it? And the problem is, from the media and political class, Michael, arguably until this election, because of course there's now a new government, maybe they'll change things, but certainly for the last 14 years with the Tories, with the media, fingers and ears, no. The burdens on business are too high in France. Then explain to me how they have 3 companies in the world's top 50 by market cap and we have 1. If the burdens are so high, but of course, they never answer these questions.
The one thing that you might say we do better, and I think there probably is, I'm quite into the sort of varieties of capitalism argument where you sort of have liberal market economies in the UK and America, so the Anglo model as they're talking about, and then you have corporatist models
there is no Anglo model
in Germany. Well, I suppose what we have is flexible labour markets, so it's easy to hire and fire, which obviously has big problems and creates more inequality and more insecurity. What it does mean is lower rates of unemployment, especially among young people. And I think potentially that is why we have better integration of ethnic minorities. Because, with all of this about France, right? Yeah, they got a clean river. They're also quite possibly going to elect Marine Le Pen as president. And that clearly means that something's going wrong.
Well, hold on. First of all, the largest party in their parliament, Michael, is a left-wing party. So that rather undermines your point about Marine Le Pen. Her party came third. That's the first thing. And yes, they have a strange non-PR system. She got 33% of the vote. Her party got 33% of the vote. In a PR system, they'd be nowhere near power, right? There would be a center-left coalition, keeping them out of power. I think you're reading The Economist too much, Michael. Liberal markets. The United States and its research is not based upon liberal markets. It's based upon the United States military.
I'm not saying that's why they've got good research. I'm just saying that it does mean that we have lower unemployment. I mean, we do have lower unemployment than the continent.
No. This is cope. You're saying there's a model that we share, the Anglo. There's no Anglo model. The United States has Apple, it has Meta, it has Microsoft, it has Amazon, it has Tesla. We don't have any of these companies. So how is our model the same?
Well,
yes, we have the shit bits.
Because we have consistently low levels of unemployment. Okay.
We have the shit bits of their system. Yeah, labor precarity. We have the shit bits without loads of energy, without the high-tech stuff, without the military-industrial complex, without being the world's policeman, without having, having the global reserve currency. Guess what? If you don't have all those things and you have the American model, it turns out you're quite poor and you have low productivity. And by the way, people say, well, France's economy is bigger than our economy is bigger than France's. It's because they work less. They retire earlier. They take more time off. Their productivity, their output per hour worked is higher than ours. They choose to work less and they work more effectively, more efficiently. Michael, they're beating us. Okay, there's no denying it.
But they are more racist than us. So America and the UK are two of the least sort of racist societies when it comes to how ethnic minorities are treated and attitudes towards ethnic minorities. And I think that, lots of people would argue that has something to do with the fact that we have low levels of unemployment because we have a liberal labour market. It's also got downsides. It's got loads of downsides being a liberal economy. But we kind of are one.
I don't know. I've never lived in France. I've never been a person of colour in France, so I don't know. What I can say is that I think the reason why you have, quote unquote, quite progressive attitudes to to people of different races, etc., is because I think we're relatively downstream rhetorically. By the way, one of the most racially segregated society into the 1960s, the United States, literally by law, anti-miscegenation laws. People from different races couldn't marry in many states in the US until the 1960s. But we are downstream from them on a bunch of stuff with regards to the rhetoric we employ in terms of the racial composition of the country, et cetera, from many one and so on. Of course, we don't have that history, but because we're little America, we basically adopt all the mores and the rhetoric that they have. France's football team, Michael, if you look at France's football team, it's clearly a football team. And you could go all the way back to 1998 with Zidane, with Desailly, with so many footballers in that team. Liliane Thuram, half the team were of African heritage. Patrick Vieira was literally born in sub-Saharan Africa. So they're racist. I mean, look, I think there's a lot of cope going on. Maybe, there's certainly a lot more Islamophobia in France, and that's institutionalized because of their Republican model. Yes, I will absolutely agree with you there. But the idea that France is more racist than the United States. I mean, how do you even measure that? I don't know how you even measure that.
Well, one thing you can do is you just do social surveys where you ask people about the attitudes of their kid marrying someone from a different ethnic minority, attitudes towards more ethnic minority people in their town. I don't have any to hand right now, but I mean, I think if you look these up...
Well, you should do. If you're going to make that point, you should have them to hand.
Well, I'm making an argument off the cuff because I think you made a bad argument, but I can't provide the data immediately live on air. Well, the bad argument is that there is no model that the United States and the UK has in common, and I'm saying there is. It's a liberal labour market, which has a lot of downsides, but one of the upsides is that it tends to make people a bit more relaxed about multiculturalism and ethnic diversity. Now, I don't have the poll to hand because I didn't prepare to make this argument, but I am very confident because I've read many an article before and looked at many a poll before that we are more open to ethnic diversity than the French
yes,
are.
But also, we don't have the same labour markets. If you look at trade union density in various industries in this country compared to the US, significantly higher. We don't have privately owned healthcare, so that's never part of people's workplace health insurance plans. So we don't... Michael, this is The Economist. But
it is easier to hire and fire people in England than France. That's just true. That it is easier to hire and fire people in England than France, and we have consistently lower levels of unemployment than they do in France. There are a load of downsides to that. Yeah, precarity is not great.
So why do they make us like the US? I don't understand.
Why don't they make us like the US?
So why does that make us like the US? Why are you saying it's... So we have a different kind of labour market to France, and the US has a different kind of labour market to us?
No, because the US also has a liberal labour market. What you're saying is the United States has a lot more successful companies than we do, which is true, but it has a similar labour market as we do, because it's a liberal, fairly open labour market where you don't have particular sort of long-term labour contracts and labour rights as they do in France and Germany, for example.
Let's just look at the basics. Fertility rate, life expectancy, energy output, food security. Like, they're killing us. If you look, even for instance, people say they've got no industrial base. They're just selling luxury goods and cheese and wine. Look at defense. Let's go all Paul Mason. If you look at defense companies in this country, in the United Kingdom, BAE Systems is a very big company. Then look at France, Dassault, Thales, Airbus. There's a lot of others as well, by the way. And this is part of the conversation I had with Angus Hansen. You have had these companies that didn't consolidate unnecessarily. Many of them are very, very successful exporters, by the way, in the way that we did. And also, by the way, France is an incredibly innovative economy. France was developing a protean form of the internet in the 1980s. It didn't quite work out. You have telecommunications companies over there, incredibly innovative. If you think about just where they came from 20, 30 years ago, Alcatel, for instance, the history behind them, very interesting. Mistral, like I said, this AI company going places. So we need to do a balance sheet here, Michael. What am I seeing in France? High-speed rail, longer life expectancy, nicer food, better food security, lower CO2 on the energy, trams, and now I'm seeing people swim in the Seine. We're losing. Okay, let's be big adults about this. And by the way, the start to winning, the first step to winning is by recognizing where and when you're losing. And that's where we are.
I'm just looking up attitudes towards immigrants in the two countries, but we might have to come back to this on a future show. We will come back to it on a future show. Aaron, it's been a pleasure this evening. Let's come back to this story. Have a fantastic weekend. I hope you enjoy the rest of the sun.
It was my pleasure, Michael. Let's. I hope everybody watching has a wonderful, wonderful weekend.
Yeah, and I advise everyone watching to do your own research into attitudes towards ethnic minorities in Britain and France. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back on Monday, of course. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.